one of the things that we know about people that write books is they know 5 to 10 times more than what's in the book, and usually more than that. And they usually had a fist fight with their editor about some beautiful little piece that ought to have been in there and didn't get in. So if I run my side of the conversation well, maybe we'll discover one or two of those Easter eggs.
I like that phrase. And the other thing is, of course, that because I wrote it a while ago, it's evolved as well, and the world has changed. So it's kind of interesting. It's kind of, yeah, it's a moving, knowledge is always a moving feast, isn't it?
Well, why don't we dive in there? What chapter didn't you write? Which, if you wrote it now, or maybe not a chapter, but a passage, would definitely have to go in.
Well, I suppose Find Your Voice is the book that I wrote just before lockdown, which is funny, isn't it? And that book is a response to technology, really, although the title doesn't really say that, because I think the biggest impediment to most of us for our gravitas and impact now is our devices and the pace of life that we have to live at. And so that there is a chapter in Gravitas called Find Your Voice, and Find Your Voice became a book. But in 2014, when I wrote Gravitas, we weren't Zooming as much, we weren't WhatsApping as much, we weren't on Slack as much. You know, it was all a little bit slower, I think.
You talk about time as chronos or kairos, and I think that that is just a wonderful distinction to draw. So as a little tempting hors d'oeuvre for those who haven't read the book, and we would like to cheerlead them to do so, can you give a bit of a précis or what was on your mind when you were distinguishing chronos from kairos?
I mean, I can tell you a story about a client last week with regard to chronos and kairos, in the sense that she's a very brilliant fund manager, asset manager, numerate, fast-paced person, and she speaks really, really quickly as a result. And she kept saying, I don't have time, I don't have time. And that's chronos, in the sense of the diary and the pressure and the pace of life, and the sense that as humans we're always going forward because our eyes look out front. And so, I mean, not in all cultures, this is not true. In some cultures they see behind them, but in our, you know, our kind of corporate Western culture, we tend to go very fast towards something. And I know that people have much more presence when they slow down to what you can call body pace, which is beat, 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 or what the Greeks called kairos, which is the idea of, I love the image of kairos as the place in the armor where you pierce. I mean, it's a bit warlike, isn't it? It's a bit bellicose, but the idea that if you're really present to the space in the armor in a fight, you'll win. But you have to be present. If you're thinking about what's happening next, it won't work. And that's true of tennis, it's true of driving, it's true of anything where we need to be physically present. And my strong belief is that for all of us, if we want impact, if we want to connect, if we want to engage with an audience, we've got to be in that kairos presence, moment by moment. But that presupposes that you have done loads of work beforehand, because it's very hard to be in deep presence, beat, 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 if you're worrying about the deck, if you're worrying about the prep you haven't done. So chronos and kairos kind of work together. You've got to do the prep in chronos, look at the diary, what's coming up, and then you've got to really be there in the moment of speaking. And I think when we do those two things, we all have natural presence in gravitas. It's a human quality.
We did a team reading of Seneca's letters to Lucilius.
Oh, lovely.
And in one of those letters, he writes, I do have time, Lucilius. I do have time. Which is an incredible thing that he wrote it twice, and that he was basically at the time he wrote that particular letter, the senior advisor to the emperor. It was like he's telling his young, apprentice understudy in another city via letter, this there's no excuse for this, I don't have time. It's the direct inverse of the statement so commonly shared. I don't have time. And here you've got this incredible man of letters, all those years ago, saying the exact opposite.
Yeah, if you could run the Roman Empire and still feel like you have time, you're going to be all right, aren't you? You know, the rest of us.
Yeah.
We always have time. I mean, we do always have time. It's always about prioritization. And he put that so much more elegantly, you know.
Yeah. I wonder, you know, gravitas is an old word, and we know it goes in with, you know, pietas and romanitas and all these sort of it's got a deep old
Virtues.
root that goes down, down, down. But it has modern day truck, it has appeal. So why do you think that is? Like, you didn't name your book Executive Presence. You named it Gravitas.
It's funny, so often these things come to us, and it was because I was being asked for it in corporate training. And I think it's a word that is not as present to certain cultures, like in some European cultures, it's not a word they really use. But I think in any Anglophone cultures, gravitas is a word that has weight. And I do think that Newton's coinage of gravity subsequently has really given it more weight. It's interesting because I think we all sense the person who has that magnetic pull, right? We all sense the person who feels like they're really planted. And I think the two words support each other. And interestingly, because I spend a lot of my time with engineers these days because they tend to run things, I think for engineers, gravitas has a literal pull because it makes sense to them in kind of first principles.
Yeah.
They can work out how you get it.
Yeah.
So perhaps as we become more engineering focused, it has more weight.
Well, I really want to commend you for taking on what is one of these, I think, really difficult, ineffable tasks, because it seems like this falls into that category of wonderful virtues, disciplines, attitudes. We can leave aside like what the right categorization is, but it falls into this category where it will be extremely hard to give a precise definition. And so we have to run around saying what else it is like and what else is like it until the picture emerges. And there's just a wonderful buffet of different things, comparisons and metaphors and similes that are used throughout your book to draw that up. Do you still find, like, when you're teaching this, that people intuitively know kind of what it is, but need a lot of comparisons to finally have it come home?
Here's the paradox. I'm a words person. You know, I studied English at Oxford back in the day, and I've always been a words person. And my clients are often words people, but this really is trying to capture, as you're saying, something deeply physical in words. And so the book is helpful, but I think if people read it without having a physical sense of what it means, it can make them quite annoyed. And there have been some responses to the idea, you know, of gravitas in a book, in a self-help form that, you know, makes people really angry, especially when it's written by a woman. But I think what I know as a coach is that when people find a sense of physical presence to the breath, to the body, and a sense of release and groundedness and openness, and when they're able to do it as speakers, phrasing, pausing, connection, and when you combine that with someone who really knows what they're talking about, expertise, because that is, of course, a huge part of it, and empathy, then it starts to become something in and of itself. But I think on paper, it's a really hard thing to explain. I had a go, but the deep truth of gravitas is Martin Luther King, right? It's watching someone who is embodied and expert and purposeful in the moment handling a crowd. And a book can only ever get 5% of the way. But as humans, we see it and we know it. So in a way, the book was about parsing a question, opening up a filter in people's brains to say, when do I see it? What does it mean to me? And how do I find it in myself if that's what I see, if that's what I like? And perhaps suggesting that we all have the capacity to find it, which also annoyed people. There were probably a few older males who thought it was kind of really infuriating that, it wasn't just for the kind of older white males. I think that's probably a dying breed, but it was certainly one of the responses to the book.
Interesting. Were they born in Victorian England?
Yeah, possibly. There's a couple of reviews on US Amazon that are fascinating and really annoyed,
Well, to give the devil his due, I think there are studies of what this meant in the glory of the kind of Greek Golden Age and the Roman Golden Age, which, if you particularly like those accounts, you might think, what has Goyder done here? She's tried to make it, what is this, like kindergarten, training for Gravitas?
Where's Cicero?
Yeah. I don't, we did do some really fun research into some of those older contexts, but I don't think that that's what you were trying to do. And you read
No.
those things too. So what was the bridge? What was the bridge from, Pietas, Romanitas, et cetera, over to 2022?
The bridge was theatre, interestingly. So, and the eureka was when I read this wonderful book, and I can't remember the name of it now, but it's in the back of Gravitas. She writes on athletics and oratory. She's a researcher, and she looks at the bridge between the two, and she talks about how the Greeks trained their orators and their athletes on the same field. And of course, for me, who was at the time teaching in drama schools, the big two subjects that you learn when you learn to act are voice and movement. Now, they're not throwing a discus, but they are, learning to move in the way that someone throwing a discus learns to move. So that idea that voice, oratory and movement athletics were one and the same thing just sparked something in me. And I knew that, if you read Cicero or Ad Herennium or any of those kind of oratory texts, you see all the exercises that I was teaching actors in voice class. And so really it was a question of, how do I take this very practical set of principles that I'm teaching all the time and that I see captured in these great texts of the ancient world, and how do I bring it forward?
Mm-hmm.
And of course, there are loads of great voice books that teach this already, but they're teaching it for actors. And there are loads of great, as you say, executive presence books that are teaching it for corporate life. But I'm always interested in the bridge, and the bridge of, oh, that's what they were doing, and this is what I'm doing in acting, and it's the same thing.
Mm-hmm.
But nobody's talking about it in corporate life. And so it was the bringing together of two ideas, which is always what fascinates me. And it's imperfect, it always is. I could have written a more academic text, but I didn't want to. That wasn't where I was going with it.
Well, thanks for not writing an academic text.
It wouldn't have been.
I'm speaking on the behalf of a pedestrian reader, and maybe on the behalf of most pedestrian readers. We didn't need citations of, what, I don't know, some medieval philosopher made out of Aristotle's words on this.
It would have been interesting to do, but it would take me up into my head again, and the journey has been getting out of my head to help me speak better. So it felt like I needed to keep it on that same practical base.
I've got this chart. There's 4 quadrants here, and you've got king and queen, warrior, carer, creator. And I think this is a lovely point of entry for people who won't know necessarily where to get started or what to check out here. But you've got these say avatars. Can you say archetypes is what you call them, 4 gears for credible passion? Can you say why you shared those, why you used that framing?
Honey, again, I go to a session last week because these are still in play for me. And I had in front of me a group of very young, very bright consultants who consult into the public sector in the UK. And often they're being told, internally and externally, you don't have enough gravitas. Now, what I know in terms of these archetypes is that if you're 24, you've got a long way by saying yes, by being the good student, right? And that takes you more into the carer mode, the relationship space, because you're attuned all the time to what will help me be successful. How can I respond to my audience? But there comes a point where you're leading a project where you're no longer cabin crew, you're flying the plane. So I'm now mixing my metaphors, and I will go back to the king and the carer. If we've survived for a long time by being carer, that gives us a very musical tonality. We tend to move quite a lot. Our heads nod, our faces are very alive to others, and our tonality often goes up at the end of the line in a lot of languages, not always. The shift from relationship, the carer mode, into the kind of king, queen, warrior mode is about the principle, it doesn't matter whether they like me or not. It's about the moment where you shift in your career and suddenly it's okay to say no. In fact, it's important that you can say no sometimes. And then people's demeanor changes. It's like if I said to you, play king, Kevin, right? You'd sit up. You are playing king, actually. You'd sit up, you'd be grounded. There would be a sense of we can engage, but we don't have to. It's not about liking, it's more about a focus on task and getting things done. And I asked one of these young consultants to stand up in front of me, and I gave her a continuum. And at one end is strength and one end is warmth. And I got her to walk down towards the warmth end and say hello. And it was warm and fluid. And I got her to walk up towards the strength end and say hello. And I said, imagine you don't like them. Doesn't matter if they like you or not. And now imagine that you're flying the plane. And she said, hello. And the tonality, the energy was completely different. And it's just an inner set of gears. And those archetypes break the gears down further because they add an element of dynamism and static. The king has that task energy and it's static, it's still. And the warrior has that task energy and it's very dynamic. The carer has the relationship energy and it's static. The creator has that caring energy, but it's really dynamic, it's mobile. And these are qualities, I mean, the archetypes are qualities we possess within us. And the idea that we can find all of those things in front of an audience is really empowering for people, because we get so stuck and we think I can't change. But this girl in front of me, 1 minute she was flying the plane.
Yeah.
High credibility, high power. And the next minute she was in warmth, standing in front of her friends. And she found that in what, 10 seconds?
Right.
It's a mindset shift, really. And it's a set of gears, practically.
In your experience, not only studying and writing and I think contemplating this so long, but in your work, what's the connection between what I'll call maybe the mechanics, the specific words that you choose, the specific amount of nanoseconds that you leave for silence, the way you ramble or scramble or shuffle into a room, and mindset? It's like, I think it's well received that those are both chickens and eggs that give life to each other. But what is your experience there in terms of what comes first?
Mindset is so important. I mean, I go back to driving lessons. I think I teach driving in some ways. It's like you get your speaker license. If I get into a car and I think I will never be a driver, then every experience that happens to me on the road is going to be fed into that filter. I'm looking for information that I'm bad at this. If within me is the idea of entelechy, which is a word that isn't in Gravitas, but is Aristotle and I love, so that's one thing that would have gone in. Aristotle talks about entelechy as the idea of the acorn becoming the oak. And if I have, when I get into the car, a sense that I am becoming a good driver, then I will filter for different sets of evidence. And I will make different meaning from what happens to me. So that's a long answer to your question. Yeah, I think mindset has to be at the root of everything. And to some extent, what I'm doing in my work is I want to give everybody the mindset that you can be a good speaker, because I remember thinking I wasn't, and how closed that felt. And the feeling of understanding I can be a good speaker, it changed my life. So that in some ways is what I'm sharing, is the shift. Yeah, you can be a good speaker too. Everybody can be a good speaker. I truly believe that.
What are the contexts in which people most seek you out around speaking? Is it stage speaking, presenting to win deals? What are the patterns in terms of where people require guidance or support?
It's a mixture. So there's always a bit of political stuff in the mix. So, you know, candidates, politicians wanting to make impact in front of bigger audiences. In corporate life, it varies from annual results presentations, pitching a bit less so, but I think the big one is internal and external presentations. You know, winning sponsorship for your vision, the exco, the board. That is often a real driver for people. And I tend to get people at the point where they're stepping up in their careers. So the chief executive who's just stepped into a new role, the CFO who wants to be chief executive, the MD who's got to present at Exco, the COO who's suddenly presenting into board. It's that place where you're tilting into something else and where imposter syndrome hits. I mean, it hits all the time for everybody, but it's those particular shifts in working life where I tend to be invited in, which is fascinating.
The image in my head was these aren't acorns, they're sort of sapling oaks about the thickness of a broom handle.
And they're feeling that, you know, they're wanting to spread up to the sky. But also, I mean, to the consultants question last week, sometimes they are the saplings. And I tend to see them in bigger groups, but I also love that. That's really fun.
I think one of the reasons that I was curious about that is that we found in our study of gravitas, and I was looking forward to asking this question. We found that in traditional texts like Cicero, it seems to be handled or addressed in this very one-way kind of conversation. You know, I'm going to now address the Senate.
Declamation.
I'm going to now do a stump speech. I'm going to give you 10 reasons why I'd be an amazing candidate for, you know, Barnstable or whatever. But I think the truth is that in say a business context, so much of the way gravitas comes across is actually in the cut and thrust of exchange, which those contexts aren't. What do you make of that? What's your experience there?
It's interesting. I mean, that is true that as speakers in modern life, we're dancing much more with an audience, but the risk was far greater for those ancient world speakers. You know, it's very unlikely that if you make a bad presentation to the board, they're going to come after you, you know, as a mob. So I think although it's more cut and thrust and you're going to get more difficult questions in the modern world, the level of risk for those ancient world speakers, the level of jeopardy was much, much higher. And I think that would have, although they're talking about declamation, they would have been reading the crowd moment by moment, just purely for survival purposes. So I think if we could time travel back to watch Cicero speaking, I suspect he would have been deploying a high level of emotional intelligence to read his levels of safety. You know, I think it's just the way it's written down doesn't fully capture that. because it
Yeah.
was mortal threat if you got it wrong, right?
Yeah, you know there must have been some very fast and clever exchanges. You get this, I guess, a little bit in some scriptural exchanges where you have, Moses and Pharaoh squaring off, and you don't just hear like a long soliloquy by Pharaoh. You get poignant questions and questions that get answered with questions and things like this.
I suspect that far less has changed than we think. I think the main change is which gender which genders get to speak. But I think the basic human dynamics of presence to an audience, shifting your intonation to capture them, reading a room or an assembly or a forum, I think those human qualities don't change because they're basically apex predator stuff, right? It's survival of the fittest, and our ancient brains are still playing that out even while we're being clever, conscious humans in the Western modern times. The threat, the deep threat for our brains hasn't changed.
You mentioned gender and men and women a couple of times. What have you been seeing and learning there?
It's still challenging for women to speak in the arena, in inverted commas. It's if you think of Hillary Clinton in that presidential election, there is still no set style for a woman orator on the big public stages. And I think that's probably changed even since that election. I can think of, the Finland Prime Minister, I can think of Jacinda Ardern. There are lots of good examples of women leaders who are finding the style. But my lovely friend Denise Graveline, who died, said this. She said, if you ever get a strange response as a woman on a public stage, you have to remember that, for all the thousands of years that people have been standing on public stages, women have been there for a very small percentage of that time. And we still, in our unconscious minds, don't quite know how to handle women speakers on stage. Even women, right? Unconscious bias is there for us too. And she said, if you get a strange response, it might not be you. It might just be something unconscious, deep that's playing out, and you just have to style it out. You just have to work with it and not be knocked, because we haven't been on those stages that long. If you think of the length of time that these texts were written ago, we've only been on a stage for a tiny amount of time. And so it's still emergent, it's still being understood. We're still finding our voices.
One of the it seems to me that on that front, one of the things that's happened through the whole history of the study of this topic is that there's multiple ways about going about it. And one of the favored ways is to look at people who just seem to have it, and then to try to work backwards with a kind of reverse engineering, like, well, what was that about? Like, well, Cicero just walked in here and absolutely killed. So
How do I do
besides
that?
going, wow, how cool, can we say even one thing in terms of the style or the mechanics or the way of the execution? So what do you think does that sort of hold a path for how women will spell out, well, this is what high gravitas feminine energy looks like?
I think it's interesting. There's that phrase, isn't there? You can't be what you can't see, and I'm not sure that that's true. And I think there are two poles in a way. There is seeing who inspires you. People often say Michelle Obama, but she hasn't held the leadership position, so she's fascinating. I would be more drawn to her as an avatar if she had been president. I mean, she would have made a great president, right? So it's, they probably just called it. But I think you can look at people who are leading, but I also think for women and for men, there is something about who am I becoming? What is the leader that I want to be? Who is the leader that I want to be? What are the values that I want to embody? How do I want to make people feel? And the reverse engineering of what will have changed when I have led this way? What will be different in the world? And I think that sense of values driving our behavior is often more powerful because it comes from a very deep unconscious place. And I think when you see the cogs whirring too much because we're trying to be like someone else, I think it becomes too conscious mind. And I think we don't trust that in the same way.
No doubt. I think we have incredibly strong instinct for it. Why is
We do.
this 23-year-old bright light young female lawyer trying to speak to me like a gray-haired 55-year-old male lawyer? Everything about it has the trappings, the pace, the tone. It's just the strangest subspecies to encounter.
And it's a kind of, there's an omission in giving those young people, and I think it's also true of men because men do it too, you know, sounding like that kind of grey-haired male lawyer. It's this, there's an omission in teaching people that they can find their own voices and also permitting them to find their own voices. And that's education, it's leadership, and it's also listening. So it's, you know, if you want to draw out someone's voice, hear them out, celebrate what's working, refine what's not. And so often people don't get the feedback as speakers. And I think for all leaders with younger teams, really tune into what's working and then draw that out of them, celebrate it, refine it. And I also really encourage people to film themselves. Because when we watch ourselves, we know if it's working or not. We see that when we're at our most relaxed and authentic, we are at our most resonant. But I think we don't see or hear that until we watch ourselves. And most people hate watching themselves, so that's the barrier.
Do you film clients?
All the time. Zoom is incredible for that as well.
Yeah. That's an interesting thing to hear. You know, Sage's our work is to build academies for organizations that don't have the resources or the attention span to dedicate to doing that valuable activity by themselves, so they get someone else in to help do that. That's what we do. So things like filming people and pressing them with the consequences of their own behavior on camera, it is incredibly hard discipline to begin to undertake. But I wasn't thinking about for Gravitas, I was thinking about for other reasons for professional development. It really is an incredible accelerator.
Game changer.
Yeah.
It's becoming our own coach, you know, it's taking ownership. And that's, you know, if we go back to that word entelechy, you know, the acorn becomes the oak when you nourish it. And that's partly, as the ancients would have told us, about being physically fit, doing the reading, you know, getting your head around the ideas. There is also something about understanding where you are at any given moment in time and understanding what you need to do. And if I watch myself on a day where I'm rushing and nervous, I'll see I'm too fast. Need to slow down, need to breathe. If I watch myself on a good day, I can kind of say, yeah, well done, you nailed that one. And it's just be your own coach. I mean, it's that Cicero, Demosthenes, you know, they were the avatars of that. They would absolutely have got behind that idea that we can coach ourselves.
Let me pick up on Aristotle, since entelechies come through quite a bit. There's a puzzle for us in our study of gravitas, which maybe you can help solve. A lot of the things that it is like, if you go too far, become a vice over here. So like clearly a contributing virtue. We could easily come up with a couple. The effective use of silence. Well, the wrong use of silence with your mouth agape and a stare into the middle distance is anything but high gravitas, right? That just makes you look like, you know, you've been clubbed with something heavy. And I feel like that wonderful list of different attributes, or maybe even techniques, they all have this Aristotelian, like, you kind of have to find the middle, the sweet spot in the middle.
Yeah.
because
Balance.
any excess of it could backfire for those trying to build gravitas.
Balance, you know, if you had one word for gravitas, it would be balance, which is where I think the Newtonian idea of gravity is, you know, I'm no physicist, but that's where I think the two words work together, because it is always that, you know, downward force balanced by the upward force. It's always that right length of pause, your attention balanced by the audience's attention. It's always about equanimity. It's always about finding a re-centered balance, you know, to every situation that presents itself. And there's a lovely word in Sanskrit, guru, which means the one who cannot be pushed over.
Wow.
And I think that's it. It's the ability of a human to be so centered, so present, so prepared that no matter what happens, they're like the weeble that wobbles but doesn't fall down. They just recenter. So it's never static. As soon as it's static, it's not working.
Mm.
It's always fluid, and to be fluid, you have to be, you know, radically present. And as soon as it's stuck, it's not gravitas anymore.
Mm-hmm.
I'm sure you can extrapolate that into physics, but I'm not the person to do it.
Well, next time when we have a panel conversation, we'll get a Newtonian physicist in here to
I would be terrified, yes.
bring it to life.
I'm married to an engineer who reminds me of my lack of mathematical knowledge every day of my life. So
How dare
let's not do that.
Good. What are you writing now? So this book, I realized usually we have the practice of reading and speaking with authors when their book is, you know, still got due on it. We had to speak with you about this book because of its interest to my own team and some of their research and writing, and to our clients topically.
Thank you.
What are you reading? What are you reading and writing now?
So I am in a very different zone at the moment, in that I'm creating a digital course.
Great.
Which is wonderful, but I do miss the deep research that I did for Gravitas and Find Your Voice. But in some ways, COVID was the spur to go digital. So I've spent the last year, well, maybe since 2020, longer than that, creating this digital course called Master Your Meetings. And so I've had to go very deep into the world of online courses. And that's been a different education. The next piece of book research I want to do when Master Your Speaking launches on the 26th, 29th of December, I want to go and research introversion, because I know that I'm working, you know, it's back to engineers. I spend a lot of time working with engineers who are often quite highly introverted leaders. And I think there's a really interesting piece of research to do around introversion and speaking. I mean, Susan Cain has written a brilliant book on quiet, but I think there's some other work to do around what allows introverts to be great speakers and how we find that. And I will get there, but at the moment I'm in digital course land. And that's just you know, twinkling at me in the distance as an appealing prospect to go and read some more books.
Yeah. Well, say a little more. What platform are you planning to use?
So we're launching on Kartra,
Mm-hmm.
which is it has, you know, been a great platform to work with. And the course it's about an hour and a half broken into 15-minute sections, and it has a lovely metric at the beginning that I've co-created with Charlotte Crowther at My Snapshot, called the Confident Speaker Score, which gives people a way to measure their confidence in speaking, go through the course, and then remeasure. So I'm quietly quite excited about this course. It's taken a lot of work, but I think it distills what I say to people in training in a way that allows it to go travel, you know, go to places in the world that I can't get to, and which also allows me then to engage with people differently, to do more coaching with people, because I've given them the core principles, the core tools.
Mm-hmm. What do we need to do to share that more broadly? I'm sure there's a lot of folks in Southeast Asia that would be keen to pick up on it when it's out of the oven. Is it out of the oven already?
It is out of the oven. I can, the link is Master Your Meetings, and I can share it with you afterwards. We would love to share it across Asia. So yes, let's do that. It is ready to go. If you want to go to Master Your Meetings and download it, you can have it instantly.
Okay, cool. We will share that unabashedly. It's very interesting. What have you learned about writing a course versus writing a book?
The touch points. Well, so a course in a way is, it's easier because you can engage moment by moment with someone and get them to go away and do something and come back. And I think in some ways, creating a course as a teacher, I was much more intuitively able to do. And
Yes.
I think the power of video and audio to suggest things, you know, as teachers, we are sometimes hypnotizing people. There's no doubt about it. You know, hypnotic language, a feeling, a mood. And I think the power of audio and video to do that is just incredible. I love audiobooks as well for the same reason.
I listened through your book, by the way, as opposed to read it in paper copy. But here I have it in paper copy because I managed to dig out a copy from someone else's library. So I'm a lucky fella.
And fair disclosure, that was the first audio book I recorded, and I think I learned a lot from recording that one that I took to Find Your Voice, because I sat down to record Gravitas, and with Find Your Voice I stood up because I realized that everything I knew about voice as an actor I wasn't able to do seated. So I actually asked Audible if I could re-record Gravitas, but they wouldn't let me. Boo.
Boo. Well, it was a good reading, and you have the good fortune of having the accent that is attributed with so much. It's endowed with so much natural authority anyway.
It shouldn't be.
My father grew up in Oxford, and so I've just been, I've got a mutt Canadian accent, but he's got that lovely ambrosial Oxford accent.
I love your Canadian accent, and the ambrosial Oxford accent should not be, it's the kind of aberration that it should be the accent that isn't an accent, but that's a whole other conversation. But probably serving me for the unconscious minds of the reader. It shouldn't be, but anyway.
We've spoken with many authors, and almost always when they read their own book, it's a better recording. There's been one or two exceptions to that, but a number of them have said that it really is its own process. They have learned things about their writing and their voice, and pace and other things in that process.
The thing I learned that I applied to Find Your Voice was I read the whole of Find Your Voice aloud in my own editing process for the book, the physical book, because my experience of getting to Gravitas after the book had been published and recording it was that I wanted to edit it. So I kind of preempted that and just read the whole of Find Your Voice aloud to myself. And that was transformative. I highly recommend it if people are writing, just to read it to yourself.
If I can jump on your bandwagon there, it's like a hard fixture in training when you teach salespeople to write cold emails, that you must have them read them out loud, so the sound goes out of their mouth and around the side of their head and back into their ears.
Love it.
And literally every time they're like, well, that's it. I mean, we don't want to say it like that. There's something.
Exactly.
And
exactly.
it's usually actually something innocuous, like the prepositions are wrong, or there's just kind of a little extra syllables, noise, fat. Wow, what a valuable thing. Okay, so now you record the audiobook and then write it.
Yeah, that and canny authors do that. They record the audiobook before the final edit of the finished book, I learned, and that's what I would demand politely to do next time. If that's not an oxymoron.
Do you see other topics that are either the branches from your last two books or otherwise that are on the docket for future work?
It's funny. I think I think most authors will say this. We just go round and around the same topic in a kind of deeply unconscious way, trying to express something in ourselves. And kind of my work is about the person who feels they cannot speak, because I was that person, the person who feels they aren't able to do this, helping them shift mindset. And it feels like introversion is the next place I want to explore. But who knows what comes after that? I don't know. I always have something that I'm curious about, and introversion is the one I'm curious about at the moment. And I tend then to read about 1,000 books, and then something comes out of it. But it's a question before it's anything else. I nearly did a PhD that was the crossover between psychotherapy and acting, but I realized that wasn't a PhD, that was a life's work. So that's another interesting question, but I think I probably need another lifetime to do that one. Maybe someone else will pick it up, because there's a very interesting, how was Stanislavski being influenced by the psychologists of his day and beyond, and how does that map into modern times? Don't know if I'm going to get to that one.
Once medical science can get us to something in the 250-year-old range, I think we can start reasonably saying, like, for my 4th PhD, I've got a cool thesis to cover.
Yeah, exactly. I'm not sure that's going to happen in my lifetime.
Yeah, maybe not. Maybe not. Well, someone will pick up the torch. Where would you like people to track you down and find you, Caroline? You're doing a lot of different things. You're coaching, you're writing a course, you're an author, you're taking on corporate clients, and my suspicion is maybe some other things I didn't just list there. How would you like people to engage you, track you down? What's your preference?
The best way to find me is on carolinegoyder.com. And you can master your meetings there. You can find contacts to say hello. I'm also a real fan of LinkedIn and Instagram, and you can find me on YouTube and Twitter. Just say hello. LinkedIn is always a really good way, and we can send anybody who's interested a confidence speaker score and a confidence booster audio course. So just drop us a line on any of those platforms or via the site, and we're always really happy to have a chat and say hello.
Super. What do you do with your we may trim the recording there, so now I get to just freestyle on a few curio questions. What do you do for your coaching work, as opposed to, just engaging an organization that wants you to teach their people? What does coaching look like in your practice?
I'm a big reverse engineer, and I'm very applied. Driving lessons is the best way to describe it. So if I think about who I'm working with, a CFO at the moment, and she wants to have more impact in her board and exco meetings. So we'll say, okay, what's in the diary for the next 3 months? You've got exco then, you've got board then. Okay, how do you want to show up at the next exco? What's coming up? And we're very, very applied. And the process tends to be 3 months, because I want people to feel like they've got their speaker license. I want them to be able to go off and practice it. And then they tend to come back when something else comes up. So it's short, sharp, practical driving lessons.
Yeah,
with a very applied tilt.
3 months is because if people do less than that, you feel like they might sort of head off and be only part way remediated.
I think there's a repetition. Again, it's back to driving lessons. If I drive every week or every month with someone over a few months, then there's a repetition of muscle memory. And speaking is driving, because it is purely muscle memory, which is why they were training the athletes and orators on the same field. So I think 3 months is just enough that they don't get dependent. And it's also enough that there's some kind of muscle memory repetition being put into place.
Can I share with you a lovely little discovery that I tripped over? The word rhapsody comes from these fellows called rhapsodes, and rhapsodes were mainly trained in the memorization of great classical works like the Odyssey or the Iliad, and they were given kind of like a speaker's license. So you'd be
Oh,
like,
wow. I'm writing
a,
this
a,
down.
a rhapsode was coming to town.
That's
And so
amazing.
you could rely on them because they were specifically trained in the craft of memorizing vast passages. They were particularly good at it for other things too. You just like a rhapsode is coming to town. So first of all, let's hear the second half of the Iliad from this guy. And then also, let's just like have some games with the fellow, like let's
What can you
test him on
remember?
how many numbers he can memorize or,
I love that.
isn't that nice?
That's gorgeous. I'm gonna go explore
Yeah.
that now.
Yeah.
That's yeah,
Well, Caroline,
fascinating.
I should share with you what's happening in the field, mainly in Southeast Asia. Our practice covers organizations in Southeast Asian countries and Canada. That's the mix. Inside professional services. So here I'm thinking law, boutique consulting, business to government consulting and relations, risk advisory, financial services, those
Yep.
areas. There's a desire to really distinguish yourself from salespeople. So all those organizations that I just illustrated have nobody with the word sales on their card.
Interesting. Yeah.
And yet they know, and at sort of a gut level, they know that is a difficult and honorable and worthy of study craft. And they know that some folks, like say, the senior partner of the tax practice is an absolute rainmaker. So
Yeah.
so that guy is great at sales, but we don't use the S word here. And so that's a huge portion of our client base. And so when they start an academy, they want to dig into that topic within the safety of the space, knowing like, look, we haven't invited sales trainers over here because I couldn't sell it to people. It's not going to happen. So now where do we go? And Gravitas is an absolute cornerstone inside the architecture of what you can build for folks like that, so they feel like they're doing something quite respectable.
That is fascinating.
Hmm.
I did a Sandler sales training, and I think for me, I had a lot of preconceptions about the S word, and I think Sandler presents it so elegantly, and a lot of the principles felt to me very familiar, and I think that reframed sales for me, actually, that whole system. It's so, the sales word is so interesting, isn't it? Because we're all selling all the time, but it has this weird people have this weird worry about it. It's so strange. Like, it needs to be reframed.
Yeah, undoubtedly. Well, one of the ways to reframe it is to tag it with some 2,500-year-old nomenclature.
Yeah, because they were selling, or they got killed.
Yeah.
And if you didn't sell your message, it was terminal.
Yeah, it was a glass of hemlock for you.
And
Yeah.
in some ways, just that reminding people that everything is a sale in the nicest possible way. Me getting my kids to get dressed in the morning is a sale. It's just like, come on, there's only a week to go.
Caroline, thanks very much. I was
Pleasure.
looking forward to this. I so enjoyed what you had already produced, so it's just a real pleasure to meet the human being.
It's so lovely to chat, Kevin, and you've asked such interesting questions. I can see that as a group, you've really been thinking about this, which is fascinating.